Secret of the Indian, Chapter 15, Interrogation. Do you remember that when Omri was reading his report, he was so excited to read his report and reading it in front of the whole school? And then when he finished, Mr. Johnson was behind him saying, "I need to see you in my office immediately." Mr. Johnson kept his hand on Omri's shoulder all the way to his office, as if he thought Omri would twist free and run for it if he didn't hold on to him. And he might have done it too, if he hadn't been half paralyzed, at least mentally, from apprehension. He knows! Those were the only words in Omri's head. What was he to do when the interrogation began, as it would in a matter of moments? Lie? Deny everything? Okay, but what if... Mr. Johnson thrust him through the door of his office, followed him in, and closed and locked it behind him. Then he walked behind his desk, but he didn't sit down. He leaned forward and rested his knuckles on the desk and glared hypnotically into Omri's eyes. "Now, Omri," he said in a clear, deep voice, which he used in only the most solemn occasions when someone has done something expulsion-worthy, "you know what I have to say." Omri swallowed and stared at him the way a rabbit stares into the car's headlights as they bear down on him. "You haven't forgotten that day last year," he said, "any more than I have. The day you and Patrick were sent to my office for talking in class. The day I went home early because I supposed I was ill, having seen something I believed I couldn't possibly have seen. You remember all that, Omri, don't you?" Omri felt his head nod. "What I thought I saw," the headmaster continued slowly, "was two tiny living people in the palm of a boy's hand. They moved. One of them was dressed as a Red Indian." "It's not right to say Red Indian," Omri heard himself say in a strangled voice. Mr. Johnson jerked his head back. "I beg your pardon." "They don't like it," Omri pursued helplessly, hardly knowing what he was saying. "You should say American Indian or Native American." "I have always said Red Indian, and I shall continue to say Red Indian," Mr. Johnson was suddenly shouting. "I say I saw a Red Indian, a tiny red one, and another figure as well, and they were alive, and I spent weeks trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen them. But I'd been overworking, I thought, and in the end I did convince myself, almost. Until this morning when I heard you read your story," he went on, leaning even closer so that Omri had to back up a step. "It all came back to me in a flash, and I knew that I was not imagining things after all. I ought to have had more faith in the strength of mind. I ought to have known I am not a man to imagine things." His voice dropped and his shoulders slumped. "I must confess it's a relief in a way. That's what it is. It's a relief." He took a deep breath and allowed himself to sit down. Omri was left standing in front of the desk. His knees had gone woolly and his face felt cold. "Now then, my boy," said Mr. Johnson more calmly, "let us take a new starting point. They were real. They are real. That is the truth, is it not?" Omri stood dumb. That means he could not talk. He shut his mouth on lies and truth alike, just stood there silent. Mr. Johnson was thinking. A year ago on the day in question, he had browbeaten Patrick into showing him the little people by means of a threat. He had threatened to telephone Patrick's father. It had worked then, perhaps it would work now. "Omri, if you will not tell me what I wish to know, I shall have to get your parents' cooperation." Omri's eyes leapt to the telephone. His mind, numb before, suddenly burst into activity. He had not locked his bedroom door because he couldn't. It only bolted from the inside. The cupboard was there, Boone was there, Matron was there, and so were a number of Indians, unprotected and alone, not to mention Patrick, in a deep coma inside the chest. If Mr. Johnson phoned home, his mother or his father would answer, and the first thing they would do would be to go up to his room if they believed it. But they wouldn't. How could they? Looking at Mr. Johnson, Omri saw that same thought came to his mind, and Mr. Johnson was not a man who enjoyed looking a fool. So think about this. What would Mr. Johnson say if he called home? "I know that Omri has some little Indians and cowboys that are alive." He'd kind of sound crazy, wouldn't he? So all of a sudden, Mr. Johnson thought the same thing, like, "Ooh, what am I going to say?" "Go ahead and phone them," said Omri. Oh, the trap shifted. It was not Omri who was caught in it now. Mr. Johnson drummed with his fingers on his desk, looking at the phone, inwardly rehearsing the conversation. No, he must get the boy to admit the truth first, but how? Just at that critical moment, fate intervened. The phone they were both staring at began to ring. They jumped, and Mr. Johnson recovered himself and said, "Hello? Yes? Headmaster here." He listened, and his face changed. His eyes flashed to Omri, and his eyebrows went up. "Yes, he is. He's with me now, as it happens." He covered the phone with his hand and said, It's your mother. What a coincidence that is, huh? Omri's in the office and his mom calls. Well, what does she want? He didn't answer. He just handed the receiver to Omri. Mom? Omri, where is Patrick? Omri's heart plummeted to new depths in his chest. Patrick? Yes, darling, where is he? I've got his mother here, frantic, and Emma's with her. His mother lowered her voice, and she's crying, and apparently she told Patrick's mother that he was spending the night with us, where of course he didn't. Now come on, where is he? I'm not sure, said Omri, which wasn't precisely a lie. There was a silence from the other end, and then, Omri, let me speak to Mr. Johnson. Dumbly, Omri handed the phone back and listened as well as he could with blood still pounding in his ears. Yes, Johnson here. Yes, I see. Yes, I remember Patrick very well. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion as he looked at Omri. You want Omri to come home? No problem about that, he said smoothly. In fact, I'll bring him home myself. Oh, no, said Omri before he could restrain himself. Oh, but yes, said Mr. Johnson. He hung up the phone deliberately and rose to his feet. Come along, my boy. My Portia is outside. You can direct me. Omri directed him to his house. What else could he do? His mind was racing ahead. Patrick's mother, his own mother, probably his father, and now Mr. Johnson? They would all be there, all going at him, going at Emma, breaking down their resistance. All he could think of by way of consolation was, thank goodness I sent Little Bear, Bright Stars, and the baby safely back. The figures were still in his pocket. Mr. Johnson parked his nice new Porsche. That's really like a fancy car, a Porsche. Some people say Porsche, but Porsche. Part of an inheritance, it was rumored. Outside the house under the big old elm that had died in the Dutch elm disease epidemic years before. But it hadn't been cut down yet. So think about that. Omri has this house, obviously. He just drove in Mr. Johnson's Porsche to the house. There's this huge, big old elm tree outside of the house that's dead. That was the one he would always look out of his skylight on. Remember all this, because it's going to come into practice later. He wished he could shinny up the side of that tree right now. If only he could be there on that branch above his attic bedroom skylight, he could manage to climb in, bolt the door, get all the little people safely in the cupboard, restore Patrick all before anyone could get there. But he couldn't do that. Mr. Johnson's hand was back like a steel vise on his shoulder. The front door was opening even before they reached it. And there they all were, waiting for Omri to explain. So he's got the headmaster's hand on his shoulder. He can't even run away if he wants to. And he opens the door, and there is everybody there. His mom, his dad, Patrick's mom, Emma. They're all just waiting to hear what he has to say. Oh, boy. All right, Omri, where have you hidden Patrick? Where is he, my darling? Honey, where's my son? Said Patrick's mom. Just wait till I lay my hands on him. Emma's face was actually the one that Omri's eyes fastened on. She looked really pathetic. When she saw him looking at her, she gave her head a little shake, which she instantly understood to say that she hadn't said anything. But they'd obviously been giving her a rough time, and Omri felt terrible about that. The mothers both looked like they were about to pounce on him. His father looked baffled, so naturally it was his father that he went to. Dad, could I speak to you alone? In my opinion, that would be most unwise, said Mr. Johnson. They all turned to look at him, and Omri saw his father's face tighten, and he turned back to Omri. Let's go into the kitchen. Could I come? Said Emma, on a small voice, as if she thought they would all start up with her again the minute Omri was out of sight. Yeah, said Omri. Come on, Em. He really felt sorry for her. She actually seemed to be shaking, and as they entered the kitchen, she dropped something that clattered on the tile floor. They both bent simultaneously, but Omri got there first, and what she dropped was a plastic figure of a girl in red. He thought for a moment it was Bright Star's figure, but it was just an ordinary girl, and before he could return it to her, his father got between him and Emma, and Omri slipped it in his pocket. Now, Omri, you better tell me at once where Patrick is. When the brain is pushed to its limits, something always emerges, even if it's the worst possible thing, in this case, the truth. He's in my room, Dad. No, he's not, said his father promptly. We looked. Omri closed his eyes and waited, but there was no more. Presumably, they simply hadn't noticed, or the little people had frozen into stillness. So he opened his eyes again, and his father was gazing at him expectantly. He's hiding. Hiding? What for? Where? Omri glanced at Emma. In the chest. His father looked incredulous. Are you having me on, Omri? He can't have been there all this time. I don't know. He was there when I left for school. But why? What was the idea? He didn't want to go home yet. And then his father said the most wonderful thing. Well, you better run up and fetch him. Omri's heart bounded with incredulous relief. Galvanized, he rushed to the door, and Emma followed close. "And I think I'll come too," said his father. And Omri and Emma stopped dead. "No, Dad." "No? No, I mean, we'll go by ourselves. Please?" His father hesitated. "This is all very mysterious," he said. "I hope there's nothing going on that you ought to be ashamed of, Omri." "No, Dad." "All right, go on, but remember, we're down here waiting, all of us, and if you're not quick with Patrick PDQ, I'll be there after you." They raced, past the little knot of adults in the hall, up the stairs 2 at a time, all the way up to the attic. Omri's chief fear now was that after more than 24 hours, Patrick would have come to some harm wherever he was. What if they brought him back and he was hurt or even... But it was useless to speculate. The vital thing was to get him back, but first Omri had to hide every bit of evidence of the magic. The second they got into the room, he bolted the door and made for the seed tray. "Give her back." He turned and Emma was standing by the cupboard. "What?" "I'll put her in myself." "Put who in? What are you talking about?" panted Omri. "It's the end, isn't it? You're sending them all back now, and you won't do any of this again because the grown-ups are near to finding out and it's too dangerous." Patrick looked at her and her face froze him. She was Patrick's cousin, and now he saw a likeness. She had that same look Omri had seen on Patrick's face so many times when he had made up his mind to do something outrageous. "What are you on about?" he said sharply. "I picked out that girl from my model set, and I'm going to make her real, and I'm going to keep her forever." Omri almost pushed her out of the way. "You're crazy," he said. He was still breathless from his run, and from stifled panic his brain wasn't working well, and he couldn't cope with a new threat. He bent to the entrance of the longhouse. "Matron!" She emerged. Her headdress was all bent, which happened only when she was thoroughly flustered. "My dear," she said, "I thought you and Patrick were giants, but some people came into this room who were even bigger than you. I think they were looking for something, and I ducked back in the longhouse the second I saw them, and I ordered all my patients to keep absolutely silent. Luckily, the giants only glanced around once, and then they went out again, but oh dear me, it was a bad moment." "You did the right thing, Matron. Now I have to send you back." "Not a moment too soon, and I think I can fairly say I'm leaving all my patients well on the road to recovery. How will you send them back, the non-ambulatory cases?" "Don't worry, I've thought about that. That means the ones that can't walk. When the chest was empty, he would just put the whole seed tray, complete with longhouse and occupants, into it. That way he wouldn't have to move the injured Indians individually. But he thought he had better send Matron back through the cupboard in case she wound up in the wrong place." Matron stepped gingerly into Omri's hand and knelt down to keep her balance as he airlifted her to the cupboard. She was looking at him closely. "My boy?" "Yeah?" "You look worried. Am I wrong in thinking that something has happened to change the situation radically?" "You're not wrong, Matron. Yeah, I'm afraid I won't be bringing you back again." She stepped off his hand into the cupboard and she cleared her throat loudly. "I can see there is no time for prolonged farewells." She straightened her uniform skirt and checked her pockets to make sure she had all her bits and pieces. Her hand strayed once to her cap, and Omri thought he saw her furtively wipe her eyes with the tail end of one of the floating ribbons attached to it. He knew he would have felt tearful himself if he was not desperate. "You have been absolutely wonderful. I will miss you," he said sincerely. "Oh, push tush, and likewise," but she choked up on the last word. She put out her hand to touch the tip of his finger. "You better hurry," said Emma. "Here, let me do it." And before Omri knew what was happening, she had shut the door with a thump and turned the key. Omri stood silent, his heart beating, feeling the pressure of time, of all the grown-ups waiting downstairs, and realized he was putting off the moment when he would open the chest. Then he was aware that Emma was standing there with the key clutched in her hand. "Now I want my red girl," she said. "You are not going to bring anything new to life right now," said Omri. "I can't let you. And if you can't see why, then I just wish I never would have let you in on the secret." Emma's hard, almost Tamsin-like look softened. "Please, Omri, just give her to me. All right, I won't do anything. Just let me have her." Omri reached in his pocket. "Right, okay, give me the key." There was a moment, a bad moment, when he thought she was going to refuse. God, this was scary. The very people you trusted most could become like strangers in their longing for a little person of their own. It was worse than the way people behaved over gold. If Emma could frighten him like this, what would have happened if the grown-ups had ever found it? Suddenly an awful thought struck him, and he stiffened with horror. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson knew, and he was downstairs now, and there was absolutely nothing to stop him from blowing the whole secret wide open. That was what he had come for, and that was what he would do. No sooner had this thought surfaced than he heard something, and Emma heard it too, and both their heads snapped around to face the door. "They're coming. They're coming up here, all of them, she breathed. Oh my gosh, thought Omri. He's told them. Think Mr. Johnson told them what's up? Ooh, they're on their way up the stairs.